one thing that we've tried to do is to try to bring this up in advance. So, for example, one thing we did was to include as part of the studio at least one class and a number of readings that have to do more with social theory and sort of the social context, issues of power, of structural issues, and so on, so that we might be able to understand better the context within which we're operating. And I think that once we understand that context, or that we at least have a grasp and a sort of confrontation with it, that then we can be more intentional about what we do within that context. How do we see ourselves? How do we see the other people that are part of these projects? And I think that helps. Nevertheless, I think it would be good for some sort of, so in advance, I think it's good. I think it prepares ourselves better. But then after the fact, I think it would be also important to have some sort of space to do that. And maybe documentation is part of that. So maybe some programs have this semester of documentation afterwards. And there's a lot of reflection in that process. How do you narrate the process? How do you approach it from a narrative and documentation perspective? And I think that could be a good spot to do that.
So for me, the important part is how you approach the different, and not knowing what the different is the important part. So the approach and not itself knowing it in advance.
The problem is not necessarily tied just with this encounter with a different land or a different culture. I think that you might find the same issues that sort of trigger these feelings about being sort of, I think it's the acknowledgement of privilege that brings these sort of bad feelings. And I think that can also happen if you're working in your same city, if you're working in the same country, if you're working. So I'm not sure that it's limited to knowing the other culture or not. I think that it has to do rather with the confrontation with the issues that bring up these asymmetries, right? Regardless of sort of the geographic traveling or displacement or not that one is doing. And I think it rather has to do with local knowledge in a way, but also a lot with social knowledge. I think social theorists are absolutely necessary, and social scientists. So I think sociology, anthropology, other disciplines have been confronted with these issues for a longer period of time than architecture has. It's pretty recent, I think, in architecture that we've been starting to think about what does imply when we decide that we're going to be involved in situations and places that architecturally has historically left behind, or that have not been a part of architectural teaching, theory, practice, and so on. Whereas other disciplines such as anthropology, sociology, pedagogy have been more confronted with those issues. So I think involving people from those disciplines who also have fieldwork experience is very important.
Yeah, I think it also depends on how the person's approach the not speaking the language. I feel like that's sort of combined as well with this power imbalances that Sebas was speaking about at the beginning. So even if you don't speak the language, if you're confronted in a situation where you don't speak, you can, or you don't understand, it depends on how you take that moment, or how you react to the others if you know you are on the outside of your normal life, so to say. And that might mean that even if you don't speak the language, you make a huge effort to be understood or to understand what they do. But you can also be like, I'm just doing my work, and this is...
even if you speak the language.
even if you speak the language, like I'm creating sort of a barrier. So I think that's important to acknowledge as well, that even if you don't speak the language, you can make an effort to be understood, or to understand what's going on in your surroundings. And that has to do with understanding the privilege you have of being there, in comparison to them not being able to be here. They also don't speak the language in many cases. So there's a power relationship as well, I feel like.
Yeah, I think that regardless of the different situations, so doing DesignBuild in the US with people from the US, doing DesignBuild in Ecuador with people from Japan, Germany, and the US, or DesignBuild in Ecuador from people from all over Latin America. I think that, of course, the details are different, and I think what made the most difference was when we were in the place where the project was done and the students were in the same place. So I think proximity and sort of length of stay makes a big difference, just like in any relationship or in any collaboration. But I think that, as Lore was saying, most of the same problems and the same sort of barriers come up regardless, because as we were saying, it's not only the cultural thing from one country to the other, but within Ecuador as well. Like, I think it's easy to sort of see Latin America or see a country like Ecuador or Mexico sort of as a monolithic block culturally, but you also have a lot of big differences there. So when we go to Chamanga, we also have to, I mean, we're also, our day-to-day is completely different from that of Chamanga. Our cultural heritage is also very different. Our histories and so on are different. And that involves sort of issues of communication, of interpretation, of everything that comes with collaborating. Also in the same city, again, because you are a professional working with teenage students, for example, was one case. So that also brings, you have to confront these issues of how do I make sure that they feel like they're being taken seriously? How do I make sure that they are actually taken seriously? How do we collaborate on a way that I sort of step off of this sort of podium of prestige that my origin or that my profession or education or whatever gives me, so that we might actually collaborate deeply. Or you're working, I think the same can happen as an architect working in a very regular office. How do I communicate? I'm designing a museum. How do I communicate with the people who know most about a museum, which are curators, are the people who work day to day in a museum? So I think that in a way, all of this is very, very similar despite the differences. On one hand, that has to do with how much time you're staying in the place and how long the collaboration is and how often you communicate before you get there. But also when you're there, I think that maximizing your presence and the time that you share with the people you're collaborating with makes a big difference. So it's not the same if you're living there, if you're spending 24/7 with them, eating with them, doing all of the activities that are not work related. That makes a big, that's one thing, and it's a completely different thing if you're just driving in, working 9 to 5, driving out, and then, because I think part of what happens is that when you interact in other activities or other levels that are not related to building, you might find out that you're actually the one that has no idea what you're doing. So if you have to cook, for example, for 40 people, which often happens on a design build site, you might find out that even though you're an engineer with a postdoc in structural calculations, you actually have no clue how to cook for 40 people. And then I think that also helps sort of break down different barriers. So trying to find different ways of collaborating, trying to find different activities.
Yeah, I feel like that is a key part of being able to communicate, to understand how the life of the other person is. It's really easy to simplify, to sort of say, well, he's doing this job because it's, or helping on the building site because he has free time. But you don't, if you don't sort of live that life, you don't understand that maybe that person had to walk 50 minutes to get to the bus and then 1 hour to get to the place where you're building. So you don't sort of understand what the everyday struggles are in order to sort of understand the other person's life and the way the other person thinks. To sort of be in someone else's shoes for a little bit, I feel like it's always good to not to romanticize the life that others have, but to understand the struggles, the everyday struggles, or the life struggles of having a family in a different condition as the one you were born in, or your everyday life.